Hi, I'm Rabbi Jeremy Kridel, the rabbi at Machar, the Washington Congregation for Secular Humanistic Judaism in Washington, D.C. And we're coming close to Passover in 2019. So this is one of our series of videos about some facet of humanistic Judaism. And we're going to talk about Passover a little bit today, or I'm going to talk about Passover a little bit today. And where I want to start is by asking the question, do you think that the Exodus story, as we know it, actually happened? For many humanistic Jews, the answer is no. The archaeological evidence just doesn't seem to support that the Exodus story happened. In fact, the archaeological evidence doesn't suggest that a whole lot of anything happened in the Sinai Desert sometime in the 13th century BCE. And if you take the Torah's story into account, the Torah says that 600,000 men, not including women and children, but men, made their way out of Egypt and across the Sinai Desert. And this is a little bit difficult to take because that would essentially mean that the population of ancient Egypt, as it's been estimated, would really have gone to about zero. So we know that didn't happen. So we're confronted with asking, if the Exodus didn't happen the way that we're told it did in the Torah, and if the Exodus maybe didn't happen at all or didn't happen in the way we're accustomed to talking about it, what does that mean for what humanistic Jews can do with Passover? And I think there are a couple of ways of going about getting to an answer on this that makes Passover still meaningful. And one of them is to recognize that what's happening in the Passover story is a myth. And not a myth in the sense of this is untrue, it's fiction, and there's no value to it, but rather a myth in the sense of this is a story that maybe doesn't have fact behind it, but still is true in the sense that it speaks to something universal about us and speaks to something central to what it means to be Jewish in this case. So here, what is the Passover Seder about? The Passover Seder, the Passover story, is about celebrating freedom and is about celebrating the move from slavery to freedom. And that's a powerful story that is shared by a lot of people, Jew and or not Jewish. We know that it forms a good chunk of the inspiration behind African American spiritual music, for example. It's a universal story, it has universal value, and we can see ourselves in it. Another way of thinking about it, and of thinking about the Passover Seder in particular as a way of attempting to relive a moment of flight from slavery to freedom, is to look at the Passover Seder as challenging us to think about what it means to be a slave, what it means to be free, what the value of that is, and what's left to do. And one of the ways I think we can get at this is by looking at something that happens early on in many Passover Seders. So in many Passover Haggadot, the book that gets used to kind of organize the Passover Seder, there's a paragraph, and it starts with the sentence, Halach ma'anya de'achalu avahatana ba'ar ad Mitzrayim. So this is an Aramaic sentence, it's not Hebrew, and it says, this is the bread of affliction which our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Aramaic is really close to Hebrew, and so this word anya in the Passover Seder is a word that means affliction, and it has a couple of other meanings, both in Hebrew and Aramaic. It means affliction, but it also means to be poor or poverty. And it's related to the word for fasting. So a fast in Hebrew is a ta'anit, which comes from the root ani, which happens to be the root that's shared by the Aramaic word anya. So when we talk about matzah, and when you say this paragraph, this sentence, you often are holding up a piece of matzah and saying, this piece of matzah I'm holding is the bread of affliction. So when we're holding up this piece of matzah and we're saying this, whatever our material circumstances are, part of what we're doing is we are taking upon ourselves the idea that we can try to understand what it means to have been a slave, or to try to understand what it means to be poor. And that's a powerful effort at getting us to try to figure out what it means to have empathy. To have empathy for people whose material situation is not as good as ours, and to have empathy just generally. So empathy inherently is kind of this idea that you find a way to understand what it is that someone else is feeling. Not necessarily that you feel it yourself, but you can understand it. And that sense of empathy is actually really, really crucial to the way that humanism and humanistic Judaism understand right and wrong. Because for humanism and for humanistic Judaism, ethics is about what will happen when I do something. Not so much what does it mean for me to intend to do something, but what will actually happen to the other person? What will their situation be? How will they feel? What will happen to them? And holding up a piece of matzah and saying this is the bread of affliction, and holding up a piece of food that is really just flour and water. There's no yeast, obviously, because it's not something that rises, but there's also not supposed to be salt or sugar or oil or any of the other things that you can use to make bread. It's just supposed to be flour and water. And if it's just flour and water, it's often not the thing you would use as your go-to bread choice most days of the week. But if you're somebody who has no time to make any food for themselves other than very quickly mixing flour and water and heating it and eating a dry cracker that sometimes doesn't taste like very much, this is actually what your food choice might be. It might be your only food choice. By stepping forward during the Passover Seder and saying this is a thing we're going to do, we're being invited, or we're inviting ourselves, to stop and consider what it must be like to be in the position where this is our only choice, where we aren't free, where we are hungry, where this is all we have. And so Passover has this sort of universal engagement in the idea of freedom, but it also has an engagement in this universal idea that maybe we could be poor. And what does it mean to act in a way that allows us to feel, or to try to feel, what other people feel like in states of oppression, in states of hunger, and in states of deprivation. And then the challenge that Passover provides us is, having thought about it, what do you do moving forward? So I'd like to encourage you, after you've watched this video, as you work through your Passover Seder or attend somebody else's Seder this year, or any year in the future, to think about, what do I get from this? What do I learn from this? What am I going to do as a result of telling this story again this year? And what will I use from this moving forward to be a better person, to make other people's lives better? So with that, I wish you a happy Passover, and we'll see you later. Please feel free to comment or subscribe to our video channel here, and I'll see you next time.